Thank you for coming. So we're going to talk about lessons learned from Black Hat's infrastructure. And I think it's important to start with some context about how big Black Hat is. So their network, 25,000 DNS packets in 4 seconds by one classroom. There are 50 classrooms. There are 3,200-ish students. There are 10,000 attendees. There are a lot of people doing what most people expected to be some pretty heinous stuff on there. And I'd like to share the experiences that I had working there as the technical engineer and volunteer director. My job covered basically everything technical at Black Hat. So I was responsible for everything from the call for paper system that you would submit talks to, on down to the websites that, the web servers that the Black Hat site is served on, and then also all of the wired network infrastructure that was used on site. So anything that a training room or a presenter would use during the course of their trainings or their presentations. And I was also responsible for the directors, I was also responsible for directing the volunteer crew. And that was immensely rewarding and a lot of fun, and gave me a lot of insight into sort of how an event goes off. And while I'm talking about volunteers, I would like to also say thank you to all of the 44Con volunteers for all of the work you guys are doing. It's been fantastic. Now, post Black Hat, I'm doing security consulting. I focus on defense, and I work for a company called Bishop Fox in the States, and you can follow me on Twitter if you feel so inclined. So Black Hat, good to talk at, also good to talk about. I've sort of laid down a little bit about Black Hat itself, and I'll talk more about that as we go on. I'd like to entertain you guys. I have some good stories. Interesting stuff happens at Black Hat, and it's always good to share that kind of thing. There were some also really great lessons learned there. I walked into Black Hat really expecting that I was going to end up in an environment where security was the whole reason for existing. And I was mistaken in some ways and not mistaken in others. And there were some really interesting lessons there. And then I'd also like to talk about, sort of the meta concerns above Black Hat. Basically, Black Hat, as it sort of educated me and brought me into the larger security consulting scene. So to start with, supporting infrastructure. Black Hat is owned by a parent company called UBM. UBM is actually based in Europe. They are a media company, and they own a lot of different events, a lot of print media, a lot of digital digital spaces. Dark reading is one of their properties as well. And a lot of people don't necessarily understand that. So the thing that's interesting about that is that Black Hat is, in that environment, just a single event of many events. And so there was only one technical staff, which was generally me over the year and a half I was there, and responsible for everything. Sometimes there were two. Right when I started, there were 2 of us, and then right before I left, there were also 2 of us. But usually there was only one technical staff at any given time, and they were responsible for everything. So there was a lot of basics and sort of ways that we had to run the infrastructure, that I had to run the infrastructure in order to make sure that it wouldn't be insecure simply because there wasn't that much manpower to spend on the infrastructure on top of my other responsibilities. A large part of that was segmenting everything. Black Hat had a really clearly defined, these are the services that are specific to Black Hat. I didn't have to deal with a lot of users. So it was easier to segment things than it would be normally. A lot of redundancy, a lot of making sure that if one component failed, I never wanted to be immediately dragged out of whatever I was doing in order to fix it, especially if I was on site at an event and the website went down. So a lot of redundancy and a lot of just keeping it really, really simple to avoid any sort of complexity that could screw things up. So the supporting infrastructure looked roughly like this. There's a dark cloud filled with Black Hats out in front of Black Hat. And we had 2 firewalls in high availability mode just to make sure that nothing, if one failed, again, we had some backup. Switches with lots of VLANs to make sure, each VLAN was set up according to the type of data that it transported. So we tried to make sure that compromise of a service wouldn't inherently grant an attacker access to anything beyond that single service they had compromised. And then we had BSD and more BSD. BSD is really simple. It's very, very reliable, and again, that was very important for me. So BSD, virtualizing more BSD, worked out quite nicely for us. So events. I'll primarily talk about USA because USA is the largest Black Hat. Again, 10,000 attendees, 50 classrooms, roughly 3,000 students. And all of the infrastructure that I set up there also applies to the rest of the events all over the world. Primarily covering wired here. There's some wireless stuff as well, though wireless was usually handled by a third-party vendor for us. So, again, volunteers would not have been possible without them. We had about 75 volunteers to run 50 classrooms, and they worked incredible hours and were, incredibly devoted to making sure that the show went off well. 10,000 attendees, trying to focus on elevating their tweets, not their privileges on my network. And then their trainings, the wired students here at 1,500 wired students, chewing gum and popping shells. There was also another roughly 1,700 students who were on the wireless. And again, those were generally managed by the third party. We didn't have too many issues with that all that often. And then presenters who for some reason thought it would be a great idea to show up to Black Hat and then be like, yeah, I have this live demo, and also I need access to a public DNS server, or also I need access to this. So a big part of it was making sure that those guys had all of the tools they need, and that they didn't have to worry about the infrastructure in the course of doing their presentations. So let's talk about the actual network itself. I mean, people make a lot of assumptions about Black Hat as a thing. I mean, it's this big information security conference. Everybody assumes that everybody's going to be out there just like wrecking stuff, stacked super deep with ODAs, just like ODAs everywhere, ODAs falling out of the network. The second most hostile network in the world. That's what people think. So security must be the top priority at Black Hat, right? I mean, that's the reasonable expectation we would have here. Hacker conference, it's not that at all. I mean, it's owned by a media company. They don't really understand security. It's not part of their business. It's not part of they're there to sell tickets. They're there to get people in trainings and to make sure that they make money at the end of the day. That's really what they care about. And none of their other events need security. I mean, the fact that hey, there's a security guy there specifically for Black Hat. Like, what more do you need? They did care about some stuff, though. I mean, they did know that the registration database getting owned for Black Hat would be a really bad idea. They knew that they had to protect CFP. There's lots of sensitive talks that are submitted. There's lots of proof of concepts that people have for exploits they were going to present there. So a lot of that information is stored in the CFP database, and it was essential to make sure that stayed protected, primarily because brand damage is a really big concern at that sort of event. I mean, they are built on the trust of the people that present at the conference. So it's very important that those people feel safe and trust the infrastructure that they're using. And that's it. I mean, that's really what the business cared about, and that was what they thought was really important. And I was really glad when I was there that these things were taken seriously, because it made my life a lot easier. It helped me sleep at night. But before I got there, their infrastructure on site, their wired infrastructure at the event looked like this. And it was Linksys routers in each classroom. It was 10100 switches. It was, handmade, volunteer-made cables. And I'm sure that everybody here has had an opportunity to find at some level, that all of your network problems were because somebody didn't actually install the cable, make the cable correctly, didn't crimp it correctly, something happened. And essentially, the year before I got there, this is what the network looked like. It was basically a self-replicating world of fire. People demanded refunds for their trainings because they weren't able to carry them out. And that's another sort of really important thing that I'd like to loop back to later. But let's talk about how it was all fixed. I mean, I wasn't around then. I arrived basically 3 months before the USA event, the following year after all of this had happened. So this is how we fixed it. Step one was segmenting our network. It was making sure that we really clearly define that stuff and replacing all of the tiny Linksys boxes with proper networking hardware. And in this case, it was Socrus 6501s, which are small. They're about a foot. They're small boxes that have 4 gigabit Ethernet ports on them. They have a 1 gigahertz Intel Atom processor, and they have anywhere from 512 to 2 gigs of RAM. And they're just really, really tiny computers, basically. You throw OpenBSD on them because it's reliable, it's simple, it's super lightweight, and it does nothing except what you tell it to, which is, again, from a security standpoint, a huge selling point to have something that I knew that if I just set it up to do nothing but serve DHCP and route traffic, it would do nothing but serve DHCP and route traffic for me. Quality of service is also built in and handled by PF and Alt-Q. They have migrated away from that recently, but it's still available. And the design, again, simple. Here's your classrooms. There's 1 Socrus per classroom. There's hotel switches with VLANs to keep the network segmented appropriately. It's really fun, I have to say, like when you get into this environment and dealing with hotel AV, when you reach the point where everything was working, and then at some point in the middle of the night, one of their network people decides to change VLANs, and a presenter plugs in, and they just get like a D-Link, like they get an IP address on a 192 subnet, and I plug into it, and I go to the gateway, and it's just like, it's like a 12-year-old router, just like random web page, default creds. You're like, this is the sort of stuff that you deal with that's kind of like just normal event overhead, just IT overhead, is people misconfiguring things. And then we had our gateway laptop. At the very top of all of this, there was a laptop. And I mean, my first knock, right? I mean, I'd come out of being a systems administrator. This was all new to me. And we had a gateway, a laptop as our gateway, because it was what we had. Because we'd never really been able to properly validate to the business why we needed better hardware than this. And I mean, we made it work. It's the same thing, OpenBSD, quad-core, battery backup. And most laptops only have 1 Ethernet port. So all of our outbound Ethernet traffic in 2012 went through a 10100 USB adapter, which is just, like the kind of almost the stuff of nightmares. Although it worked out quite well. And I mean, our NOC was also great because it had cardboard walls. It's like the entire room would vibrate when somebody walked in because it was just like partitions with cardboard. And then a power strip, a table. And sometimes the lock on the door would jam. So it was pretty secure, but I also had a lot of difficulty getting into my NOC sometimes. And that's sort of another thing that I'll come back to later. And from here, it's like there's sort of a design component that I think we should talk about threat modeling in that environment. And really, threat modeling at that point wasn't something that I had a really formal way of doing. It was just something that I kind of thought about as like, oh, I have to defend this. I need to think about who's on my network. And so roughly, it broke down like this. We had external attackers, your typical ski masked hacker, as we all know. And Black Hat had this wonderful thing where we didn't have to serve anything publicly. So I could just block them. I mean, that, like, super easy. Dude's useless. Because there's no way in. We're not serving any services. We're not exposing anything publicly on the event side. So it made life really easy. We also had internal attackers. And I really love this picture because it is a picture of somebody wearing a mask of their own face, which is probably on a really meta level a wonderful commentary about actual inside attackers. But really, it's like inside threats. But it's just a great picture. And so this no mask policy is still good. And more importantly, everybody on an internal attacker side has to live somewhere. And when I control the network and I control every endpoint and I know where people are, I know where you live. We defended basically against every kind of bad behavior on our network by just intimidating or yelling at people. One of our volunteers is a 6'5", about 280 pounds, very intimidating, a lot of bark, not a lot of bite. But we had an experience where somebody was torrenting traffic on the Black Hat network, which is like just like great. Like, why are you seeding off of this network? It's like 6:05 at the end of trainings, and we're all like, okay, everything's good, we're good. And somebody is basically sucking down all of the limited bandwidth we have to torrent some stuff. And the way we fixed that is we figured out which room it was in through the monitoring on the Socrates boxes. And then Bart, our volunteer, walks down there, and he just walks into the room, and he talks into his mic, and he just says, hey, so I'm in the room, do we still have traffic going on? Like, can you still see that traffic? And there's 4 people in the room, 3 people sort of sitting together, and one dude standing just off to the side, sitting by himself with his laptop. And the guy just looks at Bart and just closes his laptop. And Bart goes, we still seeing that traffic? Nope, we're good, and leaves. And like, that was it. I mean, it could have been a really awkward conversation because at that point there was no real there was nothing around like saying that you couldn't torrent on Black Hat's network. Like, we all thought common sense would cover that. But it was just really easy to just stand there and be like, hey, don't be a dick on my network. Like, let's just start with that. So let's break this down in like kind of a more formal fashion, right? I mean, like, I think that threat modeling is one of those things that's not super well defined, so it's helpful to sort of go through this and just like lay out each one, knowing now, having the experience of talking to more people about this and learning more about this process. So, here's a really basic threat model. You've got external attackers and they're blocked. You've got bad students who are going to be limited to their classrooms or the internet. And I mean, functionally, it's great. If you break everything in your classroom, your instructor and the other students are going to yell at you. So that solves my problems for me. And frankly, like, if you're going to show up to Black Hat, you're going to spend a whole pile of money doing a training, and then you're going to use your time there to attack random websites on the internet, like, I don't really care, honestly. Like, it's just really inefficient use of time. It's like you're not going to get anything out of it. It's going to be really awkward, and you'd be better off just spending that money, on some kind of anonymizing something somewhere else. Bad attendees, they could be jerks on the wireless network. That's actually fine. We kind of thought about it, and we thought about what it would be necessary, how much overhead it would take to try and protect the wireless in a really meaningful way, and it would be very, very difficult. I mean, there's no easy way to do that. Wireless is just a pain to secure in general. And what we instead focused on is making sure that people couldn't physically get onto any of the networks without breaking something, either by disconnecting a wireless access point, or by disconnecting some server that we would be able to monitor, some endpoint that would be monitored and would alert us so that we could immediately go find that person and yell at them. There were also some other networks that are run at Black Hat, including press, staff, and registration, and basically we just access controlled all of this. So any other network attacker would have to, again, go through this process of logging, of disconnecting something and trying to get in that way. And I mean, functionally, the reason that this threat model is so simple because it just kind of lumps all attackers into one giant, giant mess, basically, and we tried to defend against them, accepting that if somebody had an OpenBSD ODE, like, we would basically just give them a speaking slot. Like, oh, great, you owned our network, like, get up on stage and talk about it now because that's what you get. So really, like, all of this is all that was necessary to have a really, really functional defense against everybody that showed up to the Black Hat networks. So the basics of making sure that we were able to do this was really around, controlling hostility, right? Monitoring, it's so we know where we're down, we know who to yell at when people are being jerks. The wireless could auto-smush rogue APs. That was just easy enough. The third-party wireless vendors would often have something built in that would just overwhelm any rogue AP. So it was really handy for people who did try and do stuff like, Pineapple the entire network. We actually had a great moment where in 2013, our wireless provider spoofed every network that anybody had ever connected to on their own network. And they actually have a really legitimate reason for doing this that I didn't understand until I talked to these guys. And the reason they do it is because everybody's device broadcasts where it's been. It sends out a ping to be like, hey, am I in range of this network? I would like to connect to it if I am. And in order to have a good user experience, a lot of them will flood those packets, sending them like every 5 seconds or every 10 seconds. When you have 7,000 people, each person carrying a phone that's doing this, you start to saturate spectrums really quickly. So what the wireless provider would do is they would just accept any, like they would claim to be any network that somebody was looking for and just automatically connect them. And the thing about this is that only 3 people actually picked up on the fact that there was a conference-wide wireless spoofing going on. It was 1 review board member, it was 1 attendee, and it was 1 volunteer. And I think it's really interesting to note that because it kind of indicates how people interact with the Black Hat environments. Like most people very much keep their head down and they don't pay too much, like they try and avoid exposing anything at all. And as a result, like stuff like this goes on and people just, don't notice. And it was great because our volunteer discovered this and before bringing it to me wanted to, validate, like, okay, like where is this person? Can I triangulate the location of this person who's doing something? And he was convinced that like we just had the most badass hacker who had just scattered pineapples like everywhere, just had like 100 rogue APs scattered throughout the entire conference. And he ran around for like 2 hours before we finally took pity on him and we're like, okay, so we know you've been looking for this, but really you should come look at the management console and you can see like your trail of attempted connections walking around the show floor looking for where this is. And the other thing that's really interesting about this is like nobody cares as long as the internet works. Like it's kind of this reality that we have to live with, not just at Black Hat, but in a broader sense, is that like people just don't care. It's like they're connected to their home network at a conference. I guess computers, who cares? So the funny outcome of all this is Black Hat is actually a pretty nice network. I mean, it's not what I would consider like super safe. I wouldn't be broadcasting stuff in plain text. Somebody's far more likely to pick up on that for sure. But really, if you're like following, if you're VPNing anywhere, you're fine. Like it's nothing too crazy is really going on there. So with all of that in mind, I think we should address the design here, which is, what is good design with regards to this, really. And here's the design goals that I took to heart when I was setting all of this up. And a big part, is just keeping it simple. Like, yeah, always, as simple as possible is the best. Knowing my networks, drop everything that doesn't belong. Know what is going where, why it's going there, and detect or drop accordingly. Put like with like. I mean, again, Black Hat is this environment where everything's really strongly constrained, where I'm deploying the network every year, so I don't have a lot of historical overhead to live with. So it made this sort of thing a lot easier. I could just put all of the classrooms together and or put one classroom, divide each classroom out because that just made sense and super easy to defend. No physical access. So like controlling physical access was actually super critical because there was a point where, again, it's hotel switches. The hotel is managing the switches. They are the ones who are setting up the VLANs. And even at Black Hat, we had an instance where a trainer saw a random drop coming out of the wall, and I'm not going to say what trainer it is, but a trainer had a random drop coming out of the wall and just like plugged in directly to it and started issuing DHCP addresses across that entire VLAN. And ultimately, I look at that and I go like, well, like who just grabs a random Ethernet cord at Black Hat and just like shoves it into their computer? Like, oh, that's generally not something I would recommend. But on the other side, like I should have had that access controlled. Like that shouldn't have been something, I should have been validating with them that this is what was going to happen, because what ended up happening is they started issuing DHCP addresses to every gateway and every classroom, and it just became a race. I mean, like whoever basically got to it first, and they were physically closer than my gateway to a lot of the machines that I was trying to send addresses to. And so it took us a while to hunt that down because we didn't expect that there wouldn't be a random person plugging in a router somewhere at Black Hat. I mean, it just didn't really even enter into the the conversation. And make things repeatable, like automating everything we could. I had a moment where I was standing in front of the review board at Black Hat, and the GM was there talking to them about something, and I was trying to set up a gateway for presenters. And I was exhausted. I mean, it had been like a week straight of just working, making sure trainings were going, briefings were kicking off. Everything was just kind of, everything was kind of a blur at that point. And I was trying to configure this thing, and I just couldn't get it to work. And like, I'm looking down at 15 people who are some of the best in the world, just talking. And I stand up and I brush the microphone, and everybody stares at me. And I'm just like, oh my God, I can't get this working. It's just let me, I wish I was anywhere but here right now, because this is basic. What I figured out later that I've been forgetting to do was set the default gateway, and this is why BSD, right? It doesn't do anything unless you tell it to. It's a blessing and a curse. But so what I took away from that though was that I needed to automate stuff. There was no place where I could just be like, oh, I'm just going to deal with that on the fly when it happens in the moment, because there's no guarantee that I would be available. There's no guarantee that any of the things that I had taken for granted would be there. I better automate this, and I better make sure it happens. So to implement all this stuff, we did no services, right? It was acceptable. We still achieved the goals we needed to achieve while doing that. It's great. Dropped it like it was hot. 94% of our traffic was dropped at the gateway. So people were doing all kinds of weird stuff that would make it out of their classroom into the gateway and then get dropped. And that's also something that's super critical in terms of making sure that when you're feeding all of your network traffic through a 10100 USB adapter, that you aren't sending anything unnecessary out through that gateway, because you have a very limited amount of bandwidth. And we had 60 megabits of available traffic the first year that I was there in 2012. So it's there wasn't a lot of traffic available, and we had to make sure that only legitimate traffic made it out. Smart segments, again, I set it up like that because I wanted to make sure that if somebody managed to break the network in a classroom, the classroom would yell at them for me, or the trainer would get upset at them for me, and I didn't have to go in and regulate every time somebody tried to do something, weird, basically. And then obviously, the lessons learned from the controlling physical access. Protect your ports, know where they are, know who can configure them, and make sure that you don't end up in that situation. And then in automation, we had YERP. And YERP is a tool that I've sort of revised over the years, and it's designed to help you run networks like Black Hat's network, basically. It's a really simple tool. Talking to other people who have run conferences, basically everybody has reinvented this tool at some point. Anybody who runs a conference, anybody who has to deploy a bunch of machines, eventually writes something really simple that serves their needs. And the idea here was to be hey, here's something that we can all use that has sort of a broad applicability. It's really simple. It just pushes preset configurations over SSH. So you can run you have a config file. It contains templates for DHCP, PF, any other config you might need. It allows you to do a simple substitution in that config, so you can define what your internal interface is and what your external interface is, and then push out a config accordingly. And then you can run whatever commands you might need to start services, restart the box, whatever, after the fact. And it's brain dead operation. It's super simple because again, no sleep is standard, and you don't want to screw it up in front of everyone. Learn from my mistakes. And this is how you use it. It's you clone the repo, and then you just run that with your config file location set, and it just kind of works. It's really nice. It's really reliable, and it's hilariously small. I mean, the idea here was that in the long run, my goal was to be able to have something where I could take a USB stick with just the information, the relevant configs, and the tool on it, and I could deploy in an automated fashion the entire network from one box, from any box that I could basically plug a USB into and could run Python on. And it's not there yet, but someday, hopefully, I'll have the need to extend it to there, and we can automate and build on that. So the end results, because outcomes are important, is that generally people are actually pretty good. Went through all of this, expected a lot of really bad behavior on the network, and just didn't see it. The networks were designed to be secure and non-functional, very handy. The idea of failing closed is really important, and I think that one of those things that you can do where when you start to receive weird traffic or when things start to break, if they fail closed, you're never going to have to worry about the repercussions of that, except in terms of that loss of functionality. You won't have to worry about somebody using that as an entry point to your network. And the other big thing is that technical failures had a far more significant impact than any of the security failures I was concerned about. I mean, the biggest technical problem we had was state table exhaustion. There's a limited number of states that OpenBSD supports by default. It's 10,000. Now you can change that through a config setting in the firewall, but I didn't know that. And we actually, I'm relatively certain we hit this problem multiple years running, because what would happen is the first year everything was very reliable, but we had a fewer number of wired connections than we did in 2013. And in 2013, our network would just randomly die. And there was no sort of rhyme or reason to it. It would just like all of a sudden, like usually in the afternoon around 2 p.m., network would just completely stop working. And that was a problem. It was really hard to diagnose though, because every time at 6 p.m. when I had the chance to like sit down and actually test things, it was fine. And all kinds of strange behavior would pop up. Like you could do an outbound ping to something. I mean, you could do 1,000 pings a second, and it would work perfectly. And then you could take another box sitting right next to it and do the same thing. And while one was working perfectly, the other one would fail completely. It would just say like no route to host. And you could also get really weird behavior out of traceroute. Like you could get, it would hit the gateway twice for some reason. You'd be like, why am I seeing the same packet from, it would tell you it had hit the gateway, and then the next hop would be the gateway again. You'd be like, it just made no sense at all. And it actually wasn't until one of our volunteers who ran a large-scale corporate network realized that he had seen similar behavior in the past. And when he had seen that behavior, it had been because his security teams were doing scans of the larger network. Like they were doing outbound security scanning, and it was filling up the state tables on his firewalls. And he basically, he nearly got fired over that because it took him 2 months to figure it out. And so it was his experience, his pre-existing experience with that actually allowed us to solve that problem. Because again, it's not something that you entirely expect. It makes sense after the fact. It makes sense looking at it. You're moving a lot of traffic. You're moving a lot of really lightweight traffic. And while your bandwidth isn't an issue, your supporting infrastructure might be. And so again, it's really a technical problem. It's really the biggest concerns we had at Black Hat, because we were able to sort of use these simple designs, was really technical problems. And so, but that's Black Hat. Black Hat is cool. I think there's a lot of really valuable lessons to take away from all of that, though. And I would say that, let's talk about sort of the meta concerns. Let's talk about the things that I've taken away from there and I've carried into my consulting career after the fact. And so the first thing is that security is never a priority. Like it's never going to be a priority for people. We need to learn how to live with that. And we need to learn how to sort of make that more relevant. It's like I completely failed at this. I completely failed at communicating these things before the trainings failed. It's like the trainings failed, and then people demanded refunds, and then there was communication about getting the networks fixed. And ultimately, why weren't we able to communicate about that before it happened, like before it got there? And it's because we didn't really understand how to justify it to them. There was the jammed lock. The jammed lock is a good one, I think, because it illustrates that there's this piece of common knowledge that we have of like, hey, your NOC should be physically controlled. And we just kind of accept that as like a default. Like, I'm sure at some point in the conversation around this, we talked about how like, oh yeah, like, we need a NOC and it needs to lock. But really, that jammed lock wouldn't have stopped any reasonable attacker. I mean, especially considering that you could just like, push reasonably hard on the wall and it would just collapse. So it would have stopped nobody. It stopped me from gaining access to my own devices sometimes. Like, what was the value of it? I'm not saying that maybe the room shouldn't have been locked, but I just accepted that unthinkingly. I didn't look at the risks of it. I didn't look at like, hey, are there other people around? Is there other physical control that might make a lock on that door irrelevant or just pointless security overhead? Another good lesson from Black Hat was that there's a lot of advantages. Like there are advantages in everybody's network. There are advantages in everybody's configuration. And like, where are those advantages out? Like, I got to take advantage of segmentation in a way that most people aren't able to within their networks. And I know that there are advantages in networks that can be found or in people that are responsible for security. And finding those and taking advantage of them is like super critical to making sure that we actually can implement functional security. And I mean, a large part of my success as well was due to the fact that I knew what lived on my network. And again, Black Hat clearly defined, it's a good case study for this sort of thing where you can say like, okay, we have this strongly defined business case, this is how it was done, and how can we extrapolate from this to be more effective? And the other thing here too is like really, again, the company, UBM, only cares about selling tickets. So anything, you know, in retrospect, anything that I should have done with them should have been strongly linked to an outcome of how is this going to stop them from selling tickets? How is this going to stop them from being effective in their trainings or in achieving their business goals? I think if I had done that, I would have had a much easier time getting more support for more hardware, getting more support for more networking equipment, money spent up front. And actually, you know, since I've gone, they've actually been able to communicate that much more effectively now, and the infrastructure there is much more evolved than I was able to do myself because I just didn't understand how to ask for these things in the right way. So let's talk about building security into operations, because I mean, I think, you know, it's been pretty clearly established that even at Black Hat, security was never priority number one. So part of it is really coming into, you know, like how do we make this the default? How do we make it so that people just are secure? And I've discovered, especially in the consulting space, and especially in trying to help companies have more effective defense, a large part of it is just about listening to people. You know, a lot of those people that I talk to or that I interact with on a regular basis know a lot about their networks, and far more than I can ever learn in the limited time that I have with them. So listening to them is super critical, and then understanding what they need from listening to them, because sometimes they'll tell you what they think they need, but it's not actually what they need. And if you understand what they need, then you can define a way to do that securely, and that can subvert a lot of the security problems that we run into in terms of getting implementation. Creating secure defaults, like making security making the security choices for them where you can is also really critical. Like, frankly, I don't want to determine what cipher my HTTPS connection is using. I trust somebody else to take advantage of that, and we should look at the places where we are experts in the space, and we should make those defaults for people. We should make those decisions because it's not going to affect them in a meaningful way, but it could really degrade their security. And then education. I mean, you know, when you have to make somebody's life more difficult, at least have, you know, take the time and explain to them why you're doing it, because you may discover that, again, this goes back to listening to users, like you may discover there's a reason that they're doing things a certain way, and maybe you can take advantage of that. And in that education process, they'll at least start becoming an ally to you when they understand that you're not just gonna like judge them for using a simple password or something like that. Like they'll actually help you, and in a lot of cases, we've ended up with users reporting phishing attacks in a way that allowed us to discover other compromises within their network. And that would never happen if they didn't trust the security team, if they didn't say like, oh my God, I screwed this up, but I'm still gonna tell the security team because I trust that they're there to help me. And then linking security to outcomes. I mean, again, this is sort of what I was unable to do effectively at Black Hat, was like show these consequences overall and be like, this is what's gonna happen if the network goes down. You know, it's like, I don't need to spend a lot of money, but if the network does go down, your trainers are going to be really unhappy, your students are going to be really unhappy, your presenters are going to be really unhappy, and that's going to cause like some kind of profit loss to you. And that's something that's you know, good to be able to strongly link and justify. And then, you know, priority. Figure out what actually makes a difference. I mean, there's a lot of situations where it seems like we end up working on something because it seems like the biggest concern. You know, like I spent a lot of time really concerned about the security problems at Black Hat, only to realize after the fact that I should have worried a lot more about the technical problems, because the technical problems actually made a difference in that environment, whereas the security ones really didn't. And so just another level sort of above this as well is like, you know, this is a lot of the stuff that we've already seen people talking about here, you know, and I'm glad to be able to kind of piggyback on top of that. You know, Bo Wood's talking about I Am the Cavalry, and Adrian talking about, you know, the breaches and all these other things. Like, we kind of need to get out of our comfort zone, and we need to try and make more of an impact in ways that aren't what we've been doing in the past, because it hasn't really been working out all that well. It's like we're still struggling with a lot of those same problems that we've had historically. And I think a big part of that is learning to market ourselves. It's like learning to be like, hey, we are here to help you guys out. We are here to help educate you. We're here to help make your interactions more secure. It's like, Adrian's talk about, or conversation with the London cab driver is a perfect example of that. Like when people are asking you for that sort of thing, they're asking you because like they're concerned, and that's an opportunity for us to start of change how we're perceived in the eyes of the general public in a way that allows us to be more effective, in a way that allows us to get them on our side and allows us to use them as resources to help change the government process, the political process, and things of that nature. This one's one that I find particularly interesting because I'm kind of a language nerd. And if you look at the Apple PR release, the PR release, they say their services weren't breached, their user accounts were. And I'm not going to say that that's like an unacceptable use of the word breach, but I think it shouldn't be a thing that companies can say where they're like, yeah, we had major security flaws and our information that was on the inside ended up on the outside. But it wasn't our fault, and we were never actually breached. What was breached is the user accounts. Like, to me, that's sort of it's a dishonest analogy to say that your users are the ones who are responsible for your defaults that put their data into your services with minimal user interaction. Like, if that's not clear, if we can't have a clear conversation around what a breach actually means, and if non-technical people can't understand that difference, then we have a massive uphill battle to fight, because a large part of getting functional change made is going to rely on being able to agree on the words that we use. And this loops back to the lock thing. It's like the common knowledge that I had of like, hey, I'm going to lock the knock because that's what is done. It's not always right. In fact, a lot of the times it's just flat out wrong. It's just a guarantee that there is absolutely a place where you need to have that kind of physical security over your devices. But we shouldn't just take that as the default. We shouldn't just take that for granted. We should look at the situation. We should say, what risks is this actually mitigating? And how effective is this control actually going to be? I mean, I put a lock on a cardboard box. Like, it's not really, it's like borderline, it's borderline just like, parody of itself. Like that's the level that I hit there. So again, I think that's something that's important to learn from, and it's something that I've seen a lot of gains in when I've been able to roll back security policies in businesses that were really not useful and that people just kind of took as a necessity, and that bought me capital to burn with those people when I did have to make a decision that did impact them negatively. And let's make friends everywhere. This goes back to the whole cabbie thing. It's like the more people who understand about these things, the more people who care about these problems, the better off we're all going to be, and the more power we're going to have to be to actually, fix a lot of the major problems that we see. And then impact and outcomes. I mean, I think really an honest conversation needs to happen about impact and the outcomes of the things that we do. And I don't think that's necessarily something that the general public is going to care about, but we should make sure that we are understanding what we're doing, why we're doing it, and who it's going to affect. And if that's ultimately a gain in the long run or not. And I mean, there's a lot of places around vulnerability disclosure, around research that are really important, that I think we have these conversations, we understand what's going to be best for our community and what we can do to make sure that that's what actually happens. That's it. Thank you guys very much. It's been a pleasure.